All right, hey everyone. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna finish off chapter 9, and in chapter 9 we were talking about knowledge, right? So chapter 9 is all about how we're going about categorizing information and how we are actually gaining these ideas of concepts. And last week, when we were talking about this information, we ended off on the discussion of hierarchical organization. So we said that there are three category levels. You have the superordinate, which is the global, the basic, and then you have the subordinate or the very specific. So your basic category, for instance, you have chair, table, bed, which all fall under the classification of a global concept of furniture. And then you have specific examples that stem off of each of those basic levels, right? So we said that going above that basic level results in a large loss of information, right? So if you're saying table versus furniture, you lose a lot of that information as you go from that basic level to a more global, right? So furniture can be really anything, whereas table, as a very basic concept, gives us a lot of good information about that specific thing. Now, when we get super specific, we don't really gain that much information because the kitchen table and a table really serve the same functions. The only thing that could probably set it apart is location. So when we're naming items, right? When looking at items and objects, we tend to describe and identify them in a basic level sense, right? So this level of the hierarchy, this basic level, is pretty special. So if you were shown this picture right here of a guitar, most likely you would say guitar. You wouldn't necessarily use the global level of musical instrument. So if someone were to show you this picture right here and just ask you what it was, a global description would be musical instrument, but most of us probably wouldn't say that. The opposite is true for something like fish. So if we see a fish, we'll often say it's a fish. It fits a lot of the category and the concept of a fish, but we're not going to be super specific and say trout or salmon or tuna, although we might. But more likely than not, we would say fish in identifying that. So research has shown that when subjects are given a basic category label, such as car, they respond more rapidly for whether a picture is a member of that category for basic versus global levels. So, again, if you show someone a car versus a vehicle, so you see that identifying word, then present them with a picture of an automobile. If individuals saw the word car first, they would identify that stimulus quicker than if they saw vehicle. That's because car is a more basic concept and it falls within this basic category compared to vehicle, which is a more global. So Tanaka and Taylor actually looked at this kind of idea, and they looked at experts and non-experts in a given category, and they wanted to see how would experts respond when shown basic pictures of what they're experts in. So whereas non-experts just said bird when they were presented pictures of birds, the bird experts actually specified the actual given species. So on a basic level, right? So here are the experts in blue. When they were given specific examples, they were actually giving a lot of additional responses: sparrow, robin, blue jay, etc. Now, non experts would primarily fall to the basic category and just say bird. So these bird experts were more sensitive to the different features of these exemplars, right? So remember when we're talking about exemplars, these are specific examples that fall within these categories. So this shows that learning and experience of individuals is taken into account with how we are able to categorize and organize our knowledge. So, as you've seen and as we've been talking about, there's something special and there's something about this basic level that it sort of sets it apart. It's not the same for everyone though. So, people with more expertise and familiarity with some category will tend to focus more on specific information. So, just like Tanaka's and Taylor's research, when you're an expert in something, that learning and that experience is going to help you categorize and classify information. Now, moving away from the hierarchical organization, we have the actual semantic type of network, where according to this, concepts are going to be arranged in networks that represent the way that these concepts are organized. So Collins and Quillian came up with what is known as the semantic network. And the semantic network is going to look at how concepts are connected together. So according to Collins and Quillian's semantic network, concepts are going to be linked. And they're placed in a network of varying nodes. And all these related concepts are going to be connected with each other. So what the semantic network does is it models how these concepts and properties of these concepts are associated in the mind. So remember, just like when we were talking about neurons and brain cells, networks are systems of connected entities, right? So we don't really just think of one neuron all by itself. We think of the neuron as it exists in a global network. So we have more general concepts towards the top. So this is a little similar to a hierarchical model. However, we're now linking these given concepts to various nodes. So for instance, the more specific that we get in terms of a concept, the more that you're going to see that it's down from this general node. So living thing, for instance, has various properties such as can grow and is living. That's the definition of a living thing. Now, we can break this down into other concepts, so that's represented by a node, so plant versus animal, right? So the concept of an animal is something that can move and has skin. The concept of a plant has roots. Now, you can take those concepts and divide them into another node, right? So plant, you can talk about a tree and a flower. For an animal, you can break that down into a bird, a fish, you could say a human, a mammal, right? And then you have sort of classification, or different characterization. So tree has bark, is big, and has branches. And then you could also break it down into further specific subordinate categories. So cognitive economy is the shared properties that these different concepts have are only stored at higher level nodes. So for example, if you think about canary, which is a type of bird, off of that node of the concept of canary, we don't put descriptors like has wings, can fly, and has feathers. Those are all shared characteristics of the concept of bird. So if we go back to this idea right here, we see canary down here. We don't put all of these descriptors that are characteristic of birds, right? Because they're characteristic of birds. And a canary is one extension from the bird node. It is a bird, so therefore, these are properties that are making up a canary as well. So what you can do is at these lower nodes, though, you can actually provide exceptions. So in the bird category, you could have a separate node that goes off to something like a penguin. And in a penguin, you can put an arrow that says can't fly, for instance, right? An ostrich or a penguin. And according to the principle of inheritance, lower level items are going to share the properties of those higher level items, right? So a daisy, for instance, is going to inherit the property of a flower. It has leaves or has petals, right? So a daisy is a type of flower which has petals. Now, testable predictions from these semantic networks, we can look at reaction times for the time that it takes for a person to retrieve information about a given concept. We can look at these semantic networks and see how far apart they are from each other on these nodes, right? So how much time does it take for you to actually travel the distances throughout that network? So for instance, a canary is a canary. That doesn't really take a lot of people that long to say. But now if you traverse one level up and say a canary is a bird, that takes you a little longer than identifying if a canary is a canary. And then it's a little longer if you're also trying to specify the canary as an animal. The idea here with the semantic network is that animal is a higher node, right? So we had animal, and then we had bird, and then we have a specific example of a canary, right? Now this is based on categorization. So we're still able to process this a little bit faster than if we're trying to look at single properties. A canary can sing, a canary can fly, a canary has skin. So the more type of general descriptors that you get, this will increase reaction time. Now, also, due to the fact that these different concepts are connected via these nodal networks, we have what is known as spreading activation. And activation is referred to as the arousal level of a given node. So when a given node is activated, the activity is going to spread out along all of the connected links. So for instance, if bird is activated, this is going to activate all the other types of nodes that are connected with it. Okay, so thinking and hearing about a robin is going to activate that node of bird. That is going to prime related concepts and related categories. So canary, ostrich, animal. And the idea with this research of semantic networks is that concepts that receive activation and are primed are going to be more easily accessible. Because again, if you think about priming, that information is sort of more prevalent, right? So if we activate, again, this bird node, that activity spreads out to the global category of animal, but it also goes to other examples of types of birds. So according to the lexical decision task, which is a technique where we're able to assess the level of connection in terms of these primed activations, in the lexical decision task, participants read stimuli. So these stimuli are pairs of words and are asked to say as quickly as possible whether the item is a word or not. So the basic protocol here is if you have word pairs, if both of those words are indeed words, then you reply yes. If at least one word is not a word, a no is given. So you have to be able to look at both words. Now, words that are more closely associated with each other, participants have faster reaction times to say yes compared to words that are only weakly associated. So the idea here in lexical decision tasks is words that are closely related to each other, such as bread and wheat, are actually going to prime related concepts. So yes, if both strings are words, no if not. So if the words are associated, individuals have a quicker reaction time to be able to reply yes. So reaction time was faster for those pairs that were indeed words and closely associated. And this can be explained through the idea of spreading activation, since by saying something or seeing bread, that could also prime the word wheat, compared to this example like chair and money. Chair and money are not really closely associated at all. Chair is probably going to be an extension from furniture. Furniture is going to be an extension of something else, so let's say an object, right? Object might be down to currency, right? And then currency could be an example of money. So being able to get from chair to money is going to be a little bit different than getting from bread to wheat. Now, criticism of Collins and Quillian semantic network came about particularly because it can't explain a few things. So Collins and Quillian semantic network can't explain typicality effects. So if you remember from our discussion over a week ago, when we were talking about things that were typical, we are able to quickly respond to certain things like a canary is a bird, right? And a penguin is a bird. One is more typical of that category. Now, according to the semantic network, though, bird can be broken down into all the different classifications of birds. Canary can be a bird and penguin can be a bird. They're equidistant from that upper node. So according to the semantic network, we should respond equally. But that's not the case. we see that with the typicality effect, we're quicker to respond that a canary is a bird versus a penguin is a bird. But according to the semantic network, we shouldn't. So that's something that can't be explained by the semantic network. What about cognitive economy, right? So cognitive economy is, again, that idea that shared properties are stored at higher level nodes. So let's say a pig is a mammal versus a pig is an animal. Well, according to the semantic network, we should have faster reaction times for a pig is a mammal because that's only a node away. However, what's often seen is that there's faster reaction times for a pig is an animal. So think about it. Unless you have a lot of experience in taxonomy or you've just taken biology, if someone were to tell you a pig is a mammal, you would probably think about that for a second and try to remember the characteristics of what a mammal is. And then try to say, okay, does that fit the description versus a pig is an animal? Because again, animal is going to be a type of global node, which would then be connected to mammal, which would then be connected to a given category such as pig. So according to the semantic network, we should be quicker at making this connection, but we're actually quicker at making this connection. So some sentence verification results are very problematic overall for this model. So what do? Well, we sort of make it a little bit more complicated, but we're trying to instill the idea that these connectivist or these connectionist approaches are trying to model distributed processing, and we're trying to model what's going on in the actual brain during these cognitive processes. So connectionism is an approach for creating various computer models that are aiming to represent cognitive processes. So parallel distributed processing models are designed to ultimately represent concepts. And they propose that concepts are going to be represented by activity that is distributed across a network. So it's not as simple as the semantic network where we're just being connected by a node. We're looking at activity that is caused by activation in these concept networks to see how that activity is distributed throughout a network. So according to the connectionist approach, knowledge is represented in the distributed activity of many units. And these units are inspired by neurons in the fact that they're activated by stimuli, which then send signals out to hidden units, and then they can send those signals to output units. And in these connectionism types of approaches, we look at connection weights. So we look at how each connection in terms of strength is connected. So you have high connection and low connection weights. And high connection weights have a strong tendency to excite the next unit. Lower connection weights cause less excitation. So all this is similar to synaptic communication in neuronal networks. So here, in the connectionist approach, you have input units. So the activation of units in the network is going to depend on this original signal, which is going to lead towards activation of the input units. And then the varying connection weights, which are going to be shown based on these varying shades of colors, stronger network weights or connection weights are going to have a stronger tendency to excite given output units. So this is looking at the distributed process, the actual distribution of activity that's going to help to encode these various concepts. So these units in the connectionist approach are made up of input units, which are activated by stimulation from the environment, what we're looking at, what we're interpreting, hidden units, which receive input from those input units, and then output units. And these are all going to be determined by the amount of connection weight that is there. So the connectionist approach is looking at the pattern of activity that is ultimately distributed across the other units. So for instance, the concept of a canary is going to activate not necessarily only one type of node, but it's going to activate multiple types, but some to a lesser degree. Now, we also have a relation of can. So can, a canary can. And then we're going to look at other types of categories, right? Can grow, can move, can swim, can fly, can sing. So note that this relational type of concept is going to be strengthened and also activate a given area, specifically in this property. So note that there's a distributed pattern of activity across all these different units. And these are going to converge together when we're coming up with this idea of relational units and item units for identifying properties. So how learning occurs. Now we get to looking at the network responds ultimately to a given stimulus. Now the network is also provided with a correct response. So a canary can fly, right? That's a correct response. And this is modified responding to match the correct response. So there are certain connection weights which are going to be adjusted so that certain property units, right? So certain property units such as can grow, can move, can swim are going to be activated when certain concepts and relation units are also active, right? So the property unit of swim is not going to be activated, for instance, when we're thinking about canaries. So ultimately learning occurs through error signals and backpropagation. Now backpropagation is when the error signal is transmitted back through the circuit, and this is essentially going to clean up the connections. So the error signal is the difference between the actual activity of each output and the actual correct activity. Now this backpropagation is going to be sort of like a feedback where we're able to adjust. So there's a connection here between the developmental ideas of assimilation and accommodation, where again, if at first a child sees a four-legged creature and learns that it's a dog, the child has to be able to accommodate new information, such as seeing a cat. They can't call that cat because it has four legs a dog. They have to be able to take into account exceptions to rules and differences from those basic categories and concepts. So this ultimate process and connectionist approach is going to repeat until the error signal yields a 0, right? So this connectionist approach is utilizing this process of backpropagation and error signals ultimately to try to understand how we go about learning concepts and knowledge. So across various computer learning trials, you can see activity in these hidden units is going to be altered until about later on in the learning process, you can see a different distribution for each of these major kinds of concepts, right? And there's going to be shared types of categories or a shared type of activity amongst each of these, right? So for Rose and Daisy, those are both types of flowers. So you see that there's tends to be a large peak sort of here in the middle compared to something like a canary, which can sort of be similar here, but there's a lot more activity in other regions, specifically here. So this pattern of activity that's distributed is going to help take into account these different things of concepts, but then also the relation of what it has and various properties. So because information is distributed, damage to the system doesn't completely disrupt the operation, right? And this is the idea of graceful degradation. So the disruption of performance occurs only gradually as part of the systems are damaged. So because the system is so extensive and so widespread, if you damage one sole part of it, it's not going to make the entire thing crash. Now, given a big enough stroke, you could disrupt a large amount of the connectionist network. So moving into the brain, so what's going on actually in the brain itself when we're thinking about categorization and concepts? So different areas of the brain may be specialized to process information about different categories. And double dissociations have been made in certain patients for the categories of living things and non-living things, right? So some individuals with brain damage have had an impaired ability to remember and recognize living things, and then other individuals, other case studies have shown that they are impaired at remembering and recalling non-living things. So there are category-specific memory impairments that have been seen in these patients. So the inability to identify living animals but not other types of objects Maybe because in the brain we are categorizing and distinguishing certain things by functionality rather than sensory features, for instance. So the brain is a very complicated organ, right? So you have various parts of the cortex which are going to be responding to various aspects of our sensory systems. And so you have some areas of the brain, such as those that are going to be important for object recognition, that are going to be highlighted specifically when we're thinking about functionality. So things like tools are going to activate certain areas of the brain versus looking at a face. So for instance, various patients have shown that they have very low performance in correctly recognizing living animals versus non-living animals. So specific neural networks in the brain exist for specific categories, and one area of the brain, such as the FFA, which is the fusiform face area, is a given region of the brain that's important for recognizing faces. So we do have given neural networks that are going to actually be specific for categories, right? But our brain's response to items in given categories are going to ultimately be distributed over a number of cortical areas. There's not just one single isolated space in the brain that is only important for one category, right? So even the FFA, which is an area that is shown to have high activation when we're presented with a face, if you were looking at, I don't even know what I was trying to draw here. I was trying to draw a brain. There we go. The FFA, specifically in the temporal region, this is not the only area that lights up when shown a face. There's higher activation here, but you also see activity in the visual cortex, as well as if there's any other distinguishing features of the face, you might see activity in the parietal lobe, as well as other areas of the temporal lobe. So according to the multiple factors approach, we have a distributed representation. So these are how concepts are divided up within a specific category. So rather than identifying specific brain areas of networks for different concepts, we're looking at how these concepts are divided within that category. So those with brain damage who can't recognize living things versus just basic artifacts may just have difficulty distinguishing between perhaps items that share similar features. Crowding is when different concepts within a category share many similar properties. So this can look at this idea of those with brain damage who maybe can't recognize living things just due to the fact that a lot of those things are sharing so many similar features. For example, animals all share eyes, legs, and the ability to move. So if presented with two very, very similar items, like as a dog and a cat, an individual with brain damage may be unable to recognize those things because of the fact that they share so many common features. And again, note those with brain damage. So it all deals with the extensiveness of the damage itself. Whereas cars and boats share fewer properties, so these are non-living items, and so they may be more easily distinguished in an individual who has brain damage. So various research experiments have looked at presenting items to given subjects, such as mammal, pet, bird, door, and then asking them how do they associate that given item above with a particular type of sensory experience. So motion, sound, color, taste. So rating animals and artifacts on these different categories, when asked about animals, so individuals are able to rate them high compared to artifacts in terms of color and motion and other sensory types of experiences and other sensory features versus artifacts. And then with artifacts, if you're looking at how do you interact with the given object or performed actions, individuals rate the artifacts as actually higher. And that ultimately has to deal with how we are distributing that representation of those given concepts and objects. So the embodied approach is our knowledge of concepts is based on reactivation of sensory and motor processes that occur when we interact with given objects. So we look at the idea of embodiment. When we think about given objects, these can be said to be embodied in the brain. So both sensory and motor aspects are going to be reactivated when we think about a given concept. And this information together represents that given concept in our mind. So mirror neurons are neurons that fire when we do a task or when we observe another person doing that same type of task. So thinking about concepts, we don't really have to see a dog to think about a dog, right? And in chapter 10, we're going to be thinking about visual imagery a lot. So this causes activation of perceptual and motor areas associated with those concepts. So mirror neurons are a hot button issue in neuroscience, specifically with their implications for empathy, specifically in how we are able to understand and be social creatures. Now, semantic somatotopy is the correspondence between words that are related to specific body parts and where they are actually activating in the brain, right? So now this embodied approach isn't necessarily or isn't particularly useful for understanding abstract concepts. So again, if you're thinking about something like a dog or a concept of like a car, there's a lot of sensory motor processes that can be involved with our interactions with those objects, right? However, if I tell you to think about democracy, well, there's not necessarily a lot of sensory and motor processes that are in tune with those things that are more abstract. So looking here, looking at colored areas, specifically blue, showing foot movements, finger movements, and tongue movements, these are the areas of the brain that are shown to be activated. Now, the action words that are going to be representing those types, so leg words, let's say running or walking, arm words such as throwing, and face words such as taste, speaking, these words actually activate similar regions in terms of where in the brain they are actually activating. Similarly to where the actual movement was activating. So this is the idea of the embodied approach, where again, there's reactivation of sensory and motor processes distributed about the brain when we are actually thinking about these given concepts. And so we see these various activities in given regions of the brain that, according to the embodied approach and this semantic somatotopy, there's this relationship between parts of our brain's activity and the words that are related to these given areas. So information about concepts is distributed, right, across many structures. We already highlighted this when we talked about the FFA, that we said, okay, just because we have a brain region that is going to be important for facial recognition, that doesn't mean that that's the only area that's activated. So the approaches that we've discussed so far differ in the emphasis on the type of information that is ultimately important when we're thinking about concepts and categories. So the category-specific approach, for instance, this emphasizes specialized brain areas and networks that help to connect these areas. The multiple factor approach emphasizes the roles of many different features and properties. And then the embodied approach emphasizes activity of the sensory and motor properties of objects. Now, the last type of model in this case is the hub and spoke model. Now, this is emphasizing that areas of the brain specialized for different functions are going to be linked ultimately to an area that integrates the information. So the hub in the hub and spoke model is the anterior temporal lobe. So damage to this hub will generally cause general deficits. Now, if you damage the spokes, which are the areas that are connected to it, this is going to yield more subordinate or specific deficits. So damage here in this hub area is seen in those with semantic dementia. So semantic dementia dealing with the knowledge of facts, not necessarily your episodic type of memory. Now, there's a possibility of other areas being hubs. This isn't saying just the anterior temporal lobe is the hub for the brain in terms of information processing, but this is one in particular. Now, you can think about the temporal lobe's role with learning and memory. This could be a reason why this area of the brain is particularly implicated here as being a sort of hub for information processing. And so really cool techniques known as transcranial magnetic stimulation can actually lead to stimulation of given brain regions, as well as in terms of sort of shutting off different regions of the brain. So these red bars are looking at response times before stimulation by TMS, and these blue bars are response times during the actual stimulation. So actually looking at naming latencies of various types of artifacts in living. So when you actually stimulate various regions of the brain, such as the parietal lobe or the anterior temporal lobe, so the anterior temporal lobe primarily as it relates with that area being in the hub and spoke model, as sort of important for being able to actually integrate that information. You see differences here between when the brain is actually activated and when the brain is not activated through magnetic stimulation. So through the process of looking at this chapter, we've looked at how we are able to organize concepts, how we're able to categorize things, how we're able to ultimately acquire and be able to encode knowledge. Now, I know knowledge is sort of just this global type of broad category, right? And hopefully you were able to sort of look at these grander concepts and try to apply them and see and gain an appreciation for this subject. In the next few chapters, we'll cover visual imagery as well as language and decision making and problem solving.